Today we have Greg Grant, and I have a little bio here for him. Greg is a Smith County horticulturist and Master Gardener Coordinator for the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. He is the author of Texas Fruit and Vegetable Gardening, Texas Home Landscaping, Heirloom Gardening in the South, and the Rose Rustlers. You can read his Greg's Ramblings blog at arborgate.com. Read his In Greg's Garden in each issue of Texas Gardener magazine, or follow him on Facebook at Greg Grant Gardens. I do that. All right. Greg and his Cajun bride, how many years, Greg? This is a test.
The reason I was hesitating, it was 7 last week, but when I got married, married in dog years, because Greg was never going to be married, so it's been 70 years to me. So. I wasn't prepared to be married, so it's like,
it was better before.
I worked in the same dog.
All right. Greg and his Cajun bride live in the Pineywoods at deep East Texas in his grandparents' old farmhouse, where he tends his Rebel, Eloy, Emanis, Pine Savanna, and Bird Sanctuary, 2 dozen chickens, 1 Jack Russell, and 1 cat named Biggy. He also just informed us that he's actually gone through the Master Gardener program, so he is a Master Gardener just like us. You said one of the few.
It can happen, people. So.
He's also working on his Ph.D. at Stephen F. Austin. Nice. Nice school. So without any further ado, Greg Grant. Oh, let's do one more thing real quick. Bill, what I need to give this out so that someone doesn't actually try buying this. So what number did you come up with in your head?
I always like 7.
Okay, can you look and see who 7 is?
Pam.
All right. Thank you. Let's see about getting him to autograph it.
I will.
Greg,
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk about perennials today, and like most of my education, it's ad nauseum, and so at some point you will not be able to take anymore, and that's perfectly fine. And so there's no way you can learn it all. I just want to give you a taste of it and tell you where you can learn more and some references, that sort of thing, because you can't learn it all. And that's the beauty of it. That's why gardeners live to be 130, because there's always something to learn. And that's why gardeners tend to be happier and healthier, because you're engaged. There's something interesting every day of your life. And just when you think you know it, because I literally was going to learn everything about gardening. I was the keeper of the class terrarium in 1st grade. I read a book about George Washington Carver in 4th grade and said that's what I was going to do. And the more you learn, the more there is to learn. And then working on the Ph.D. is another thing. The more you know, the dumber you get. And so you finally realize, like, I know this much, and I'm only going to know this much, and there's this much to know. And so it's a good thing to me. And so no matter how much you know about gardening, you just know a drop in the bucket. And that's okay. So gardening, you can know nothing, you can know it all, you can be, it belongs to everybody, no matter what level you are, master gardener, non-master gardener, rich, poor, educated, uneducated. Gardening is everybody's, and you do it the way you want to it. You know as much as you want. So I tend to overeducate and throw it all out there, but don't let that scare you, because it really means nothing. I enjoyed the days when I knew nothing about gardening, and I loved gardening, just as much. And so you don't have to know any of this. Now you may get tested over it, I don't know, but it won't be me. So we're going to talk about perennials today. Now, first of all, I gave you a handout there. I can tell you already know this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And so let's quickly go over this handout that says perennials here before we get into some pictures, because you need to know what a perennial is. And so a lot of beginning gardeners are confused about what's an annual, what's a perennial, what's a reseeding annual. So an annual is a plant that dies each year, generally just after a season. So annuals, even if an annual comes back, think about bluebonnets. That's a plant that comes back every year, but it's coming back from seed. So it doesn't matter if you're reseeding or you come back every year. A perennial is a plant that comes back every year from a piece of that plant, a corm, a root, a bulb, a rhizome, a crown. And so the perennial is the exact same plant coming back year after year from the same plant part. And so now, as you notice on the list there, we can have short-lived perennials. So if you're all engaged with gardening, following people on Facebook or Martha Stewart and people from Europe and the North and all that, well, some of those perennials are annuals here. And so just because it says it's a perennial in a book or a catalog or a TV show doesn't mean it's a perennial in Texas. And so it all depends on where you are. So a lot of the perennials that they grow in the rest of the world are not even perennial here. They might even be short-lived annuals here. And so you got textbook definitions and you got on-the-ground horticultural definitions. So I tend to deal with what it is here. And so if it's not a perennial here, well, I don't even acknowledge that it exists in my head to even talk about. And so to me, there's no reason. It has to be really showy that I'm going to grow a perennial for an annual. There might be a few cases that you do that. And then you have to divide all plants, all herbaceous plants. Herbaceous just means leafy, not woody, something that tends to die to the ground every year or within that season. So all herbaceous plants are divided up into cool season and warm season. So every beginning gardener and every new master gardener says, I want a plant that lives every year, evergreen, blooms 12 months of the year, no insects, no disease, never die, doesn't need water. And I said, don't forget the $20 bill shooting out of leaf axils as long as you're placing I said, there's nothing like that, and there never will be. So in the perennial world, you're either growing when it's cool and dormant when it's hot, or you're growing when it's warm and dormant when it's cold. So there is no year-round perennial. And then it brings up, we'll talk a little bit later about combining them. I mean, you could grow a perennial border where you got part cool season, part warm season if you wanted something year-round, but there's no plant that's going to look good year-round. It's got to be dormant during the hot season and the warm season. So we divide them up into cool season and warm season, just like we do annuals. And that means you plant them at different times, ideally. Now, Americans aren't the most highly evolved gardeners. As opposed to Europe, you'd go to a nursery and they'd be selling things opposite the season when they're in their bloom, and you're buying a plant that doesn't even have a bloom on it. Here, we buy things in full bloom during their season, which is not the best time to do it, but sometimes that's the only choice we have because nurseries here are a wholesale nursery industry is all based on selling things in bloom. Every research that's ever been done will show if you plant an annual or perennial opposite of its season or out of bloom, it's going to grow bigger and make more flowers than if you planted it in bloom, but oftentimes we don't have that option. So realize cool season, warm season, short-lived, long-lived, aggressive. You hear a lot these days about invasive plants, and we won't spend much time on that today, but invasive plants are plants from another part of the world, another continent, and that escape from our gardens or sometimes escape from agriculture or something else. And then they spread like a native plant, but they spread out of control and they take over entire ecosystems. So if you think about Bermuda grass, Johnson grass, crabgrass, Chinese tallow, Chinese privet, plants like that. And so part of the reason they spread is they don't have any natural predators. They don't have any natural insects, no butterfly, moth larvae, anything. So they just keep going and don't stop. In the native plant world, we have lots of plants. You think about a trumpet creeper, spreads around a lot. And some people say, oh, that's invasive. And I'll show a few perennials. Really would be an example like that. If it's really aggressive and beats up every plant in your flower bed, and doesn't jump the fence and run down the street and grow in the woods and the pasture and the fence row, then we don't consider those invasive. And so we kind of got a different term. And even in the invasive plant people, they'll put some things out there like Arundo Donax or golden bamboo, and those aren't truly invasive because they don't make any seeds, so they're extremely aggressive, and they'll make clumps the size of this room and swallow up everything, but they don't spread across the country by seed. So truly invasive plants spread by seed and take over entire ecosystems. So just because there are some perennials that are garden thugs, are basically what we call them, and that's okay because there are a lot of places we're used to growing wimpy little plants in flower beds that are dying all the time. We're constantly replacing, we're primping and looking after them. So there's nothing wrong with having a perennial that fills up the whole bed. And so the key is you just put aggressive things next to aggressive things. You don't put aggressive plant next to a weak little plant because they always blame the aggressive plant. Once you learn, you eventually get smart and you blame the weak little plant. So here's a plant that needs water and fertilizer and primping, and don't curse the plant that knows how to grow. But if it jumps your fence and runs all over the country, then those are true invasives, and we wouldn't want those. And then in Texas, you see that category there called tender perennials. We don't grow the same perennials they do grow in the north and Europe. Those are all very cold hardy. They have cold winters, mild summers. Well, we have mostly mild winters with a disaster thrown in every 20 or 30 years. And then we have hot summers. And so our climate actually most of the growing season more mimics the tropics than it does a temperate zone. So a lot of our perennials in Texas and the South are actually tropical plants. It just happen to be cold heart. The roots don't freeze. Our ground rarely freezes here. Now, the last time a lady asked me she'd moved down from the north, what's the frost line here? You know, how deep does the ground freeze? I'm like, are you nuts? The ground hadn't froze here in 30 years. Well, that was right before 2021, where like the ground froze, the telephone pole froze, your house froze, the pets froze. And I'm like, okay, occasionally it does freeze. To be honest, actually, there was snow and it didn't freeze in either, because snow is a great insulator. But so we have lots of things that we grow as perennials that would never be perennial in the North and Europe, and you'll never see them on their TV shows or books or magazines, because they're just pot plants and tropicals for them. But because they're so adapted here, but it always brings up the question, you know, is this going to be perennial? It depends on the winter. The ground freezes, no. If it's young and you just planted it in the fall, probably not. And so all those tender perennials are some of our better perennials, but you can't really guarantee that they're always going to be perennial. A lot of the lantanas are like that. New Gold lantana is a perfect example. Most of the time, you may plant a whole bed of it, and 1 year 9 out of 10 plants come back. 1 year 3 out of 10. 1 year none. And so the tender things, you just no guaranteed. But because we have a long, hot, humid growing season, those tropical plants thrive for a much longer period of time. We get a lot more blooms out of them. So it's a trade-off. Plumbago is another example. So anyway, that's some of those definitions there. And the characteristics, most beginning gardeners tend to get into 6-pack annuals, most of the stuff you see at the big box store. And unfortunately, a lot of those are, some of them, the showiest they're ever going to be is when they're selling them there. So they sell what they call a finished product, which they're basically finished. That's the best they're going to look. So you buy a 6-pack of coxcomb or something, the best it's ever going to look is when you go past the checkout stand, because they're really bred for northern climates and European climates where it's mild all summer long. And so, you know, our summers tend to be disasters. So some of those spring blooming 6-pack bedding plants are not really good long-term. In the old days, you know, gardeners would change out their beds 4 times a year, maybe even more. So you'd have a spring annual, you'd have a summer annual, you put in your fall stuff, then you put in your pansies. And so a lot of times there's 4 changed out. And that's a little bit ridiculous, but here again, it's your yard, your garden, you do what you want. It gets kind of expensive. And so inflation has run up the price of everything from fertilizer to plants. Now, heck, you're paying like, you know, $6 or $7 for a vegetable plant. Now I'm like, well, that's not terribly cost effective. And so over time, you'll learn to be honest, if you learn to grow truly adapted perennials, they're much tougher, much longer lived, much easier to propagate, divide. So I've done things like where I'm planting a bed the size of this room, but I can only afford 1 plant. And then over 10 years, I've divided that plant and filled up the entire bed. And in between, you know, I'd plant reseeding annuals, or I'd put ornamental sweet potato or something to cover the ground instead of using mulch, because living mulch tends to be better. And so much better investment. And so I use this statement all the time, because as a lifelong gardener, I say, if I knew then what I know now, I would have paid $1,000 a piece for about 20 plants. Because now I've spent $100,000 on 1 million plants, all of them dead except 20. And so it's all about the value of what you get. So sometimes people laugh at me because I'll like order for a $100 bulb through the mail. Now, oh my gosh, I would never pay $100 for that. It's going to outlive me. It's going to reproduce, make, you know, thousands of bulbs over its time. So in the long run, it's like investing. And so if you can put a dollar in and it disappears, it's not that big a deal, like planting an annual. But you may put, you know, $1 million $1 bills in there, but they all disappear. That's not a good investment. But if I put a $20 bill in there and it doubles and quadruples and you got compound interest and I die with, you know, $10 million, well, it was a much better investment to begin with. So think about the value of any plant that you plant, not what you pay for it, what's it going to do for you in the long run. And so that's really the benefit of perennials, properly chosen. So if you're not careful, you pick up the wrong book, the wrong TV show, the wrong Facebook page. Social media has a lot of good stuff on there, but I'd say 90% of it is wrong. Either it's not for us, like the lady the other day told me about her vegetables weren't working out. And she was following this lady and she had just planted such and such. And I'm like, oh, that's about 3 months off. I'm like, where's she from? England? We're the opposite of England. So when you watch a TV show or read a magazine, or nobody reads real books anymore, but if you're looking at something from the north of Europe and it's talking about a perennial or anything else for that matter, it's so opposite that if they say live, for us, it means dead. If they say good, it means bad for us. And so it's really hard. And I tell people, don't even read it, don't even look at it, because knowing yes is no and no is yes and live is dead and dead is live, that's really complex for somebody to understand. So just don't look at it. So anything you're reading, make sure it's somebody from the South and you're right on the edge of where things really start changing in Texas. And so I live in the Pineywoods over there. You're right where the Pineywoods quits and the post oak Savanna begins. And so that means the rainfall's dropping off, the soil pH is changing. And so as you go west across Texas, we go from 60-inch swamps in southeast Texas to 6-inch Chihuahuan desert in west Texas. And the pH goes from, my pH is 4.2 at home. And you get to the hill country and it's 8.2. And so very, very different. Sand, rock, pH, we're almost almost zone 5 in North Texas. We're almost tropics in South Texas. So Texas is impossible to say something does all over the state. It doesn't work like that. So you have to know your region, who's that person that's telling you that information, have they gardened there, and even better, go places and see what they have. And don't go to the richest, nicest, newest house in town, because they fake it. Going to see the new neighborhood is like going to the golf course and the rose garden. That's like IV hookup artificial gardening. So if you can afford to replace it all the time to keep it look pretty, that's not, it's okay. But my wife didn't fully comprehend gardening. And so what she thinks of as gardening, I consider decorating. And there are a lot of people that are, especially new gardeners, you go buy your pot mums, you go buy the little annuals, you put out all the colored pots and stuff, but nothing is really living. It's just it's like putting out cut flowers. And so real gardening is like digging and dirt and seed and ants and plowing and plucking and picking and stuff, living and coming back and pruning and all those stuff that, not necessarily fun and it's not always pretty. Well, that's what gardening is. And so gardening is growing a plant. And so you have to distinguish. A lot of these people on social media, they're garden decorators. And one way to know is they've got 10 plants planted in a pot where there's not even room for one in there. And they're like, that stuff's not going to grow. No more than you grow 10 puppies out of a teacup. I mean, so you can tell pretty quick that people are just decorating. And same way with vegetable gardening. A lot of people I give a talk called fiddling or farming. So think about that. We're talking about perennials that grow. And when you plant a plant, be it an annual or a tree, don't think about what it looks like in that pot, because everything's going to be in a small pot. That's why people plant, 1 gallon live oaks or red oaks that are going to grow 60 feet tall. And you got a power line 15 feet above. You're like, well, it's little. They all start off little. And so it doesn't matter if it's a dog or a kid. Don't think about what is now. Think about, can you afford him later when he's eating too much? So let's dive into perennials. So as I mentioned, perennials come back every year from a piece of the plant that's normally underground. And so crowns, that's just sort of that combination where the root meets the stem. Roots, and of course, there are all different kind of roots that plants can come back from. Bulbs, tubers, corms, rhizomes. And there are a few things that we grow that are sort of subshrubs that kind of come back from a woody base there. And so the term herbaceous, that just means you're not woody, you're not a tree or a shrub. And as I mentioned, it can be cool season or warm season. So big question is always, well, how do I use perennials? And so depending who you've been inspired by, or what book you saw, or what social media page you followed, you might just think of perennials as one thing. And so traditionally they've been used in borders, but perennials can be used in a pot. They can be used as bedding plants. They can be used as ground covers. They can be used as mixed borders. They can be used solid. And so it's just another plant. And so once you get to be a real gardener, or for that matter, a farmer, rancher, anything else, it's all kind of the same stuff. And so the tough part about beginning gardeners to realize is gardening is half science and half art. And then, of course, landscaping and decorating and all that sort of stuff, that's all art. And you don't have to combine that all together. But certainly if you're designing a place for the public, or somebody's paying you to do it, you have to know something that's acceptable art. Once again, at home, you do whatever you want. And I have to tell you, the majority of the stuff I learned in my life wasn't in school. It was planting stuff at home and going to see people that garden. And, a lot of it was wrong. But one thing about doing stuff wrong, right doesn't look so good till you put it up against wrong. live doesn't look so good till it's sitting next to dead. You know, your least favorite color looks pretty good next to brown and dead and crinkled. And so don't be too hard on the plants and don't expect too much, because a lot of new gardeners expect everything. Well, the story of life is don't expect anything, you're not going to be disappointed. And so that's the best way to look at gardening too, because it's not always going to work out. And gardening, we've got it so finessed and fine-tuned, we think we can control everything. Well, we can't. All you have to do is look at 2011 drought or 2021 freeze. I mean, or in my case, dogs, cats, inebriated relatives. There's always something going on that's messing up your plants. But you know, life is half living, half dead. Nature is half living, half dying. I mean, that's really the best you could expect out of any garden. And you can fake it the best you can. And really the only difference between gardeners and non-gardeners is gardeners pull up the dead ones and replace them with live ones. The non-gardeners just stand there like, it's dead. I got a brown thumb. It's dead. No, everybody's stuff is dying. So I start off my Master Gardener class every year. They're all like eager, you know, tell me the magic potion and the handshake so we can grow everything and be the best gardener on the planet. I said, let me tell you something. Day one, every plant you plant is gonna die. And they're like, oh, what? Yep. No. I said, that ain't the half of it. You're gonna die, your spouse is gonna die, your pet's gonna die, every tree in the forest is gonna die. That's what it does. It's all gonna die. Your job as a master gardener to drag it out as long as you can. So don't flip out like every beginning gardener. It died. It was gonna die anyway. And so that's what happened. Stuff lives and it dies. And in nature, half of it is in the process of dying. And so your garden is going to be a reflection of that. So half of it is probably in the process of dying. So if you keep it 51%, you're beating the odds of nature. And so do whatever kind of combinations you want, but make sure the plants are adapted, make sure they're heat tolerant, make sure they're drought tolerant, make sure they don't have to be sprayed with insecticides and fungicides and miticides and fertilized all the time. So here's a traditional English style perennial border. One thing, although that was actually in Belgium, one thing I like about the English style of gardening is they didn't learn it from the rich people. The French did that. So the French had really formal gardens, gardeners clipping, shaping, you know, changing out colors all the time, changing out beds all the time. The English got inspired by the poor people. And so people like Gertrude Jekyll and William Robinson, well, everybody's trying to copy French gardens and all this formal stuff that you couldn't afford, you know, the average person couldn't afford to do that. Well, a couple of really prominent gardeners at the time looked around and said, these little poor people have flowers and vegetables. They don't buy stuff. They got herbs. They got roses draped over the house. They got stuff coming up in the cracks of the paths and whatnot. And so these little cottage gardens were just gardens where people, like country people to this day, they got plants like my relatives. They didn't buy stuff, but they had stuff. And so some of the smart people looked around and said, why don't we use what they're doing and then make it acceptable to the general public? So they literally took the little poor people's country gardens, cottage gardens, and they took that French style formal structure. And so the origin of a perennial border was basically a rectilinear bed with a little country style cottage garden dropped in there. Because if you and there were times where English gardens and gardens all over Europe ripped out all the fancy French gardens, and a lot of them put in pure cottage gardens on a grand scale. But some people, it's just like today, said, it's a little too messy for me. And so what they eventually kind of settled on was keeping that French style formality with the English style informality in it, and it became more acceptable. And to this day, the majority of the world tends to grow perennial borders still based on that concept of some sort of formal structure, but informal planting in there. That doesn't mean you have to do it, but that's the style that's most popular around the world. Now let's just look at what I'm going to show you is a drop in the bucket. So I gave you a list from my mentor, Dr. William C. Welch of perennials. We're going to talk about Texas superstars later. I'll give you a handout that's got a list there. I got a few listed there at the bottom. It's ironic that when I started in horticulture, 30, 40 years ago, I was a county horticulturist in San Antonio. Dr. Welch was just starting to work on a perennial book that I'll mention a little bit later. And he had me go give a talk for him in North Carolina on perennials. And of course, I'm just as new and green as a gourd. And I remember this lady said, we can't even grow perennials here. There aren't any perennials that grow in the South. And so what she meant is none of the perennials that you read in the books and saw on TV or saw in the White Flower Farms catalog would grow here. But Dr. Welch was the first one to point out we're covered neck deep in perennials in the South. They're just not in books and catalogs and pictures. And so he did a whole book based on that and pretty much did a whole career and did lots of gardens. And so he was the first to go around and identify all the perennials that we had. Some of them were old-fashioned plants, some were new plants, some were native plants, but we had lots of perennials for the South. But the perennials for the South don't grow in the North, don't grow in Europe, and nobody had ever taken recognition. So I'm just going to show you a drop in the bucket. So you don't have to copy these, you don't have to run home and plant these, you don't have to start Googling trying to find where to get these. This is just to get you an idea. And I want you to kind of soak in some of the pictures that I show and just to be thinking about how you could use perennials in your landscape. So Anisocanthus, or hummingbird bush, is a native plant to southwestern Texas and Mexico. Now, the problem with it, Krishar, what do y'all call yourself here? Central Texas, East Central Texas, Central East Texas? Yeah, what are y'all here? I mean, I watch the loblolly pines trickle right into. Yeah, see, you just your own thing. That's good for Texans. So hard to put a Texan in a box. You don't want to put him in a box with somebody else because somebody's going to die. So it's probably good that we're born independent. And so you can't just take, our summers are generally so long and so hot and so dry that the first thing you want to do is like go to Mexico or Arizona and bring back all the drought tolerant plants and just grow those. Well, the problem is our winters are wet. So the majority of Texas, even more so than the rest of the Southeast, works on a wet dry cycle. 9 years out of 10, we have wet winters. Occasionally when you have a dry winter in Texas, like 2011, then you think, oh, this is not going to be good, because 9 out of 10 years we have dry summers. And so if you put a dry summer followed by a dry winter, then hell breaks loose, literally. But if you use just drought tolerant plants here, when we get either we get tropical storms and hurricanes, or we get our wet winters, well, they rot away because they can't take it. And so it takes special drought tolerant plants to grow here. And by the same token, you take stuff that tolerates soupy, messy, wet soils. Of course, they're going to parch during the summertime. So really takes a special breed of plant to grow here. And this just happens to be one of those examples of a plant that will tolerate extreme drought, that you can also take it east and grow it all across the Southeast. But with my gardeners, I would tell them only follow university information, cooperative extension programs in any state in the Southeast. Kind of ignoring Texas, because the majority of Texas is not East Texas. So Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, same people, same twang, same turnip greens, same plants, same soils. And so any of that will work. Now here, you're actually better off, instead of following stuff in the Southeast, you're better off following Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, because you just don't have a lot of stuff. If you go east, too far east, you got to start picking through and knowing, well, yeah, that looks good here, but it's not going to look good at home. That looks good, and there's nobody there to tell you that. And most people think if it looks good, they're so stupid. They think if it looks good at the nursery, it's going to look good at home. And as we know, that's not always the case. But anyway, one of the rare plants that's from out west that does here comes in a red, orange, and even a yellow form. And the hummingbirds, of course, like it. Anybody have hummingbird feeders and watch the hummingbird migration going on? So my little wife, who's not terribly interested in outdoor stuff, although she does like birds a little bit, she likes your chickens. But when you got hummingbird feeders swarmed with hummingbirds looking like bees, she suddenly took interest the other day and even made her first hummingbird food the other day when they were out, because I'm having to fill them up every day. And so that's it's really important that we have nectar sources for hummingbirds, because every hummingbird in the United States funnels through Texas. And I've never been to the Rockport Hummingbird Festival, but I would like to. But I noticed a lady on Facebook the other day, I'm all excited about my 3 feeders. She said one of the ladies on our tour had 120 hummingbird feeders. And I've seen the pictures. It's literally like a swarm of bees down there. Because, every hummingbird in the country comes down to Texas, and then they head across, a tiny little bird across the Gulf of Mexico and spends the winter in Costa Rica and Central America. By the same token, we've got another unusual thing that goes on here with the monarch butterfly. And so it's also the only migratory butterfly, and every monarch almost every monarch in the United States funnels its way through Texas and goes to Mexico. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the genus Asclepius is the genus for milkweeds. And so the most common milkweed in horticulture is the butterfly, well, no, I'd say the second most common worldwide, Asclepius tuberosa, a really pretty plant, does well here. Not so easy to find in the nursery trade, although last year there was a nursery in Nacogdoches that had flats of orange, flats of mixed colors, flats of yellow. I'm like, oh my gosh, and they were beautiful and had like 3 or 4 plants in each little 4-inch pot. So I'm like snatching them up left and right. It's a great plant that's not always available. And so the monarch butterfly, which is the Texas state insect, by the way. Yeah, let's give you a little test here. So I gave you our state insect. Normally when I ask that, people guess like fire ant, mosquito, blah, blah, blah. Nope, it's the monarch butterfly. So our state flower is bluebonnet. How many species of bluebonnets in Texas? 6 at least. And all 6 are recognized by the state legislature. It's our state flower. And what's our state tree? Pecan, yep. If you moved here from the north, it's not pecan. So that's what my Granny Ruth had under the bed when you stayed over there. So it's a Native American word, so pecan, not pecan. When you hear some Indian saying pecan. And so our state bird, loud, obnoxious, classic Texan thing. I really wish it was the painted bunting, which is mostly Texas and surrounding states. Multiple states have the mockingbird but they are fun to listen to and listen to who they're copying, but they're like me giving a talk. They will not shut up, including at night, morning, whenever. All right, here's a tricky one for you. The state stone. Dun, dun. No, okay, let me tell you, when I taught school at SFA, just before you get all carried away with throwing out the answers there, if you give the right answer, I give you an A, you go home for the rest of the semester, never have to come to class again. Yay! If you give the wrong answer, I give you an F, you leave the class and never come again for the rest of the semester. So that shut down all those shouting out answers left and right. And so one guy made 3 Fs in one day and had to miss 3 classes, 3 semesters. So yeah. Any other answers? Anybody really confident in an answer? It's the only state I can think of that has a plant for a state stone. What? Sort of. Petrified palm. Most of the state designated things tend to be something close to Austin where, somebody lobbied for it. Petrified palm is mostly an East Texas, Louisiana thing from an old extinct palm. And one reason I like that, you can see how my talks go 2 or 3 days. And so East Texas and the good chunk of the eastern part of Texas is sort of the biological crossroads of America. So you're a prime example in this very county, because you got Mexico down here, you got the hill country right there, you got the eastern forest here, you got the plains and prairies to the northwest. And it's, to be honest, it's Texas is not a good place to garden, because what do we hear all the time? It's too hot, it's too cold, it's too wet, and it's too dry, and that was just this week. And so it's always something. But if you look back in our geologic history, like looking at that petrified palm, we've been all of that in the past. And so we've been bottom of the ocean, we've been colder, we've been drier, we've been hotter. And so we have remnant plants left over from all those periods of time. And so a lot of those prairie plants are back when we had less rainfall. Some of our cool plants like that palm, or even things that are here today like passion vines and pawpaws, also left over from those tropical days. And when it was hot and steamy and the ocean wasn't too far away. And then we've got, of course, a lot of our wildflowers are Midwestern plants. We've got desert plants, so we've got agaves and opuntias and manfredas left over from our hotter, drier times. And yet we got a lot of cool trees. So when the glaciers covered Canada in the Northeast, those plants were forced down here. So we've got things like trilliums and sugar maples and beech trees and whatnot that are left over from that period of time. So even though it's a bad place to garden, it's one of the few places on earth that you see all of those plants come together. And that's the same way it doesn't matter if you're doing trees or perennial borders. You have to acknowledge that we're a little bit of all of that, and it's going to be an eclectic mix, not like any place else on the planet. But you get a diversity and a range of plants that not a lot of places get. And butterfly weed's a good example. Now, most of the country sells you Asclepius curasavica, the tropical milkweed. I used to not get too excited about it, but then there started to be some rumblings about there's a fungal disease that the monarch butterflies can catch from that plant when it doesn't freeze back. Well, I spent most of my life gardening in areas where it froze back. Didn't seem like a concern. Well, now they're doing more and more research, and so there's some chemicals in there that cause some issues with the monarch butterfly about migrating and doing all sorts of stuff. And so all of the experts in the Xerces Society and all those say don't grow the tropical milkweed here. And so it's easy to grow. They sell it by the tons. It reseeds, but they're saying not to do it. And one reason that they're not near as available, but we have a dozen plus native milkweeds in Texas, which you should. Once again, every monarch in Texas goes through Texas to Mexico to spend the winter. And then it's one of the most amazing things in the world that they spend the winter in Mexico. They fly back to Texas, immediately lay their eggs on anything in the genus Asclepius. So depending on where you are in the state, there's different. We've got 4 or 5 here in East Texas. And then those caterpillars hatch, they eat, and then they fly north, and they do 3 or 4 generations up north, and then the grandchild or great-grandchild of the one that spent the winter in Mexico suddenly realizes that it's time to go back to Mexico. They've never been to Mexico. They've never met anybody that's been to Mexico. Not just Mexico, the exact same forests, the exact same trees. And that little normally butterflies only live 3 or 4 weeks. Well, that one has to live 3 or 4 months, fly all the way, maybe Canada, Michigan, Virginia, wherever, all the way back to Mexico. And second most important to them is Texas, and it all has to do with the Asclepius as far as raising them. But we have lots of native ones, and so what we want to try to do, harder to find, is use native milkweeds in our gardens, not just in the wild landscape. So that's Asclepius viridis, the green milkweed. This is the red ring milkweed, Asclepius variegata, and so it's a good project for master gardeners and other groups to work on is propagating native milkweeds because they're vital to the monarch butterfly. And so that's what the caterpillar of a monarch butterfly looks like. And you think your grandchild is spoiled about what they eat. Well, this thing eats one species on the planet and nothing else. And so really cool about evolution of a wildlife is so that's it takes the toxic alkaloid for that plant, puts it in that caterpillar, puts it in that butterfly, and then other butterflies evolve to look like that butterfly because you got birds not eating the monarchs, you got queens and viceroys looking like it. So it's amazing for teaching kids. Now the cool thing about these milkweeds, they're the host plant for the monarch butterfly, but they're nectar plants for a whole different set of insects, and so they're bee pollinated. And so there's actually a little slit right there. A bee comes in there, and as it's after that nectar, its foot like hangs on looks like a little wishbone or a pulley bone from a chicken, and then hauls that pollinia to the next flower to get it pollinated. So pretty amazing. Now, as I mentioned, the monarch got issues. So all the monarchs east of the Rockies have declined by 85% in the last 20 years, from hundreds of millions down to 250,000. The western monarchs, they actually go spend the winter they live in California in the northwest, and they go down to California. So they've declined by 99%. Not an endangered species in the United States, although they're certainly concerned about it, but an international group declared it an endangered species. And there's this big issue going on now about, are humans causing all this extinction because 1 million species are facing extinction worldwide, and so the monarch is certainly in that group. And so anything we can do because it's our state insect. So Texans are fiercely independent about loving to fight, and so this is something we can fight to save. The purple coneflowers. Now, there's no easy, perfect way to tell you on all these plants which exactly plant you want to get. And so you can go to any nursery in the world, any catalog in the world, and there'll be a whole plethora of echinacea cultivars in there. Double ones, doppelganger, white, yellow, orange, red, and they're not all adapted here. And so anytime you grow a plant, realize that plant was native somewhere. We talked about invasive plants being native elsewhere. Native plants are plants that were native wherever you are, basically pre-humans. And so in the case of us, we're looking at 16,000 years ago, the glaciers receded. And so our plants that we have in the wild here been doing their thing for 15,000 years or so, usually millions of years, but it warmed up at that point. So pretty much the conditions we have now. But a lot of those plants were taken into horticulture, a lot of them taken to Europe and developed into all sorts of cultivars. And so if you just got a cultivar of something you found in the wild, I like doing that, put a name on it, they call those nativars, pretty much the same as doing a wild plant. But if you've 100 years removed from that native plant, somebody breeding a bunch of things in a greenhouse and crossing different species, you may come up with a beautiful plant that really doesn't even grow where it came from. So there are lots of purple coneflowers on the market now that you can take to the Midwest or North Texas or wherever Echinacea is native to, and they won't even live as a perennial. So you got to be careful about how highly evolved, how removed those genetics are from the wild species. So it's not as simple as just running to the store saying, Greg said get purple coneflower, it's a perennial, it's native to Texas, because what you buy may not, it may be the exact same species, it may be some complex hybrid, but that's why as gardeners we have to constantly sift through the information. We have to visit trial gardens, we have to talk to people, we have to find people that know, because it's not just as simple as saying this species works, this one doesn't. Some of them it works like that, but in this case it's not that easy. So you'll have this pass along version. It's kind of the same as what it is in the wild, easy to grow. But the fancier it gets, the bigger the flowers, the more colors, the more recent introduction. A lot of those things are not real good perennials for the South. And so here's a good example of one I got from a lady, Cleo Barnwell in Shreveport, probably 30, 40 years ago. She loved bulbs, she loved antique roses, and she loved wildflowers. Lived to be 100, like a good gardener should. And she was a Texan by birth, and so she had that purple coneflower in her yard and shared seed with me and been growing it ever since. And so that's the kind of perennials that we want, and that's the kind of performance you want. And so it needs to be, and that's the easy way to do it. If you know somebody that has something, then you know that does that, and you trust that person's opinion. She had studied gardening all her life, as opposed to flipping through a book or catalog, even worse, following somebody on social media without even knowing who they are or where they are. And so, and you hear this all the time. I did my research. What do you mean you did? I watched like 3 or 4 YouTube videos and I read my mentor, one of my mentors, Dr. Parsons, I was a young whippersnapper horticulturist in Bexar County. I'd spew something out and he'd say, how do you know that? I read it. Who wrote it? Well, I'd like, so-and-so. How do they know it? Well, I don't know. I just thought if you read it in a book, that made it right. And he said, a lot of people, he was a garden writer too, so a lot of people write stuff and make it up or don't know, or it sounded good. And he said, and then once one person writes it, the rest of them all write it. But he said, you got to go find out what the right answer is. And so you can't just be copying somebody else and nowadays, because that was before social media, this stuff just spreads like wildfire, and some of it's just completely wrong. And that sometimes they don't mean to be wrong. Some of them are, I don't know, it's just stuff and stuff and stuff. And so just because you heard it or somebody said it, and some of that stuff is you look at it, it's like, that's not even a real plant or a picture. I mean, so some people just love to put stuff out there. And of course, we got all this clickbait stuff that sounds great. Be really, really careful. And that's why I tell my master gardeners to stick to either a really good gardener that you knew, like in our case, the county horticulturist that retired in Smith County, Keith Hansen, has his own website, East Texas Gardening. He was the father of our little botanic garden there. And so everything he does is based on experience, has a master's degree in horticulture. And so that would be okay. Otherwise, stick to university people, public gardens that you know those people there, as opposed, Dallas Arboretum is a public garden, but they spend millions of dollars on single plantings. Six-year-old to teach me how to shut my phone up. And so you got to be careful who you're copying, who you're listening. So learn who to trust 100%. Now, if you like fiddling around and trying and messing up, I enjoyed that early on, but at some point you get tired of trialing things, see everything die, or coming up with a grand idea and watching it fail. And so it's up to you. Lantana, there are lots of different cultivars of lantana. The first, we'll talk about superstars later, one of the really good ones, but it's not always super perennial, is New Gold. So lantana comes in several different species, Lantana chimera, Lantana montevidensis, the hybrids that are spreading. A good bedding plant, but just don't count on it always as a perennial. Now it's going to bloom from spring to frost, and you get a long growth period out of it. No better butterfly plants than lantanas. Who can name that butterfly? Oh, gee, somebody was just fixing to say, I don't want him to throw me out.
Exactly.
Uh-huh. Tongue's bleeding up there because she almost bit it off. So. Gulf fritillary. And so, remember I told you about all our complex plants here with that host on one genus in the world, Passiflora. And so if it wasn't for passion vines, we wouldn't have that butterfly. If it wasn't for our ancient history when we were tropical, that's when we got that, not only that plant, that's a tropical family of butterflies. And so that's a remnant of those tropical days when the pawpaws, when the passion vine, persimmons, or palmettos, those are all left over from then. And so that butterfly is only here because of that plant. That plant's only here because of that period of time. A lot of different lantanas. We won't go over all of them. Variegated lantana. When I worked in the Lone Star Growers years ago, another thing in horticulture you have to learn is cultivar names, trademark names, and so it went around as Samantha as a cultivar name. Then you had Monrovia out in California had trademarked the name Lemon Swirl, and then you had Heinz Nursery in Houston had trademarked the name Lemon Marble, and so there are 3 different names for the same plant, all exactly the same plant. So that's another thing you have to learn in horticulture, what cultivar names are and what common names are and species and that sort of thing. Salvia farinaceae is a native salvia to Texas and no place else on the planet. So primarily in the hill country, growing in rocky soils. Blue flowers, I noticed y'all had some dwarf cultivars out in the flower bed here. Now, I say it's easy to grow. Here's another prime example. Europeans got here, saw this pretty blue flower in hill country, took it back to Europe, turned it into dwarf things with darker blue flowers, less mealy white on the calyx there. But yet, some of those you buy that the rest of the world grows as an annual are not good perennials in Texas and generally don't live past 1 year, even in Fredericksburg, where they came from. So it's just another example. Just because it looks pretty in the nursery and just because they sell it and just because it's that exact same species that's native to Texas doesn't mean that particular plant is going to grow even in Texas where it came from, because they bred it to be an annual bedding plant for the rest of the world. But for us, it was a long-term heat-tolerant, drought-tolerant perennial. So a lot of times when there's a plant like that, I'll go out and try to reverse the history, kind of breed backwards, which breeders think are stupid. So I went out into the wild 30 or 40 years ago to select the best stuff out of the wild to find something that's still prettier than the wild stuff, but long-term perennial. And so I just accidentally ran across this particular one, not that bad, but that cultivar was in a cemetery in north of LaGrange, and so I named it Henry Duelberg. So it's more like a wild one, but darker blue flowers. There was a white seedling of it that we named Augusta Duelberg. Matter of fact, there's the very grave that they came from. And so anyway, that's I love looking for plants for the people that aren't good garden. Remember I said if you go to the nicest neighborhood, they're like sprinklers running 7 days a week and the gardener's hired and people are the IV hookup thing. So I like to go look at the opposite kind of conditions. You know, they don't allow live plants in cemeteries anymore, but it used to be a good place to hunt for plants. Poor section of town, ditches, abandoned homes. That way you find the stuff that really likes to live. So, and then you go home and trial it with all the rest of the stuff and find out, who's the best. So that was the first Henry Duelberg salvia in a garden in Texas. And then here it is in another garden. So it's a pretty common now, but of course taller, more like the wild plant. Flower color more like the modern plants, but much more vigorous than the European style cultivar. So that's Henry Duelberg salvia, and the white version of it is Augusta Duelberg. That's actually at Longwood Gardens in Pennsylvania, so that's pretty cool. Same plant. That's Augusta, the white flowered version. Ironically, that when you grow Henry Duelberg from seed, normally you'd have a whole range from light blue to dark blue. This thing either makes dark blue seedlings or white seedlings. And so they came from that same grave there, and it looked a little different from the wild one. So I thought maybe Henry was like a salvia breeder. When they died, they dumped this stuff on his grave, and so named it after him. And I thought probably she was the gardener, and so maybe she did all the work and he did nothing. So you had these white seedlings that were on the grave too. So we decided we'd name one after her and one after him just to make sure and cover our bases. And there's some at the garden I had one year. That's Augusta Duelberg. And there's an example of a mixture of annuals and perennials. And so you can have a mixed border. You can have an annual bed, you can have a perennial bed, you can have a mixed border with woody plants and herbaceous plants, with woody plants and annuals and perennials. So it's up to you what you want to do and which parts you want to change out. And then mostly salvias are made for bee pollination. So we hear a lot about the plight of the honeybee. And so we got to realize honeybees are from Europe. And so we brought those over and keep those going. There are 400 plus native bees in Texas, maybe 700. And most gardeners in Texas can't name one of them except the one from Europe. And so not right. And so there are a lot of plants that are made not just for bees, for very specific species of bees that fit that exact flower, everything from the size of the flower to the shape of the flower to the length of their tongue and all that. So we need to do a better job of gardeners of learning our native pollinators. Salvia gregae is more of a subshrub from southwest Texas and Mexico, all different colors. The further east you go, the less happy it is. And so all salvias like to be sheared about monthly. And so a lot of beginning gardeners have trouble, clipping back on a plant, but it makes all of them look better. Any ever blooming plant, whether it be a lantana or a salvia. But with Salvia gregae, it's the difference between living and eventually dying. So eventually just turn into kind of a scraggly thing with some blooms and leaves on top and kind of give up the ghost. Where if you kept it sheared once a month, almost like the shape of a dwarf Yopon holly, it keeps reinvigorating itself. And so there are a lot of plants like that. Petunias are like that. Verbenas are like that. And salvias love to be sheared and pruned. Not pruned back hard. Light shearing is like cutting off your split ends or something. One of the early plants that was going to be a Texas superstar was Indigo spires, which was an accidental cross between our native Salvia farinaceae from the Huntington Botanical Garden in California and a salvia from Mexico, Salvia longispicata. So the gardener's out there working one day, and here's this amazing little love child that came up in the garden. I say little because it turned out to be like a lot of plants and animals that are hybrid. You've got heterosis or hybrid vigor. Think a mule. And so the hybrid between the two was stronger and bigger. Sterile, didn't set seed, but made a giant plant. So unfortunately, Indigo spires is not really common in the trade. You have a cultivar there. A single quote. Because it gets too big. Now, I don't mind a garden plant that's pretty, that lives, attracts pollinators, beautiful, that gets 4 feet tall and 7 feet wide, but a nursery in a 4-inch pot or a gallon pot didn't want something that just constantly, and it was so vigorous, even using growth regulators and stuff, you couldn't make it settle down to belong in a pot. So that's another thing about nursery plants. There are good plants out there that we can't buy at the nursery because they don't fit the nursery trade. They have to be something they can propagate. They have to take water once a day. They have to fit in a pot. They have to fit in a rack, and they have to stay at the nursery. And so, the things they breed are specifically for the nursery trade, and that eliminates some really good plants for us. And unfortunately, you get some really bad plants that really don't belong in our garden because they fit only the nursery trade. But Indigo spires is still a good plant, and all salvias are really easy to grow from cuttings. Almost can root them like a coleus in water. And there you see most people I say shear your plants all the time. They never do it, and they get all scraggly, and they wonder why mine look pretty and theirs didn't. I had one friend in Nacogdoches, he'd shear his stuff so much he wouldn't let them. I'm like, Bill, you gotta stop and let it bloom in between and shear it between the bloom cycles. But he actually did a good job on Indigo spires. That's about as dwarf as you could ever keep because he sheared that thing all the time. But you see, if you got something that blooms on new growth and you're shearing it, it's just constantly making it thicker and more flowers. Typically, you'd wait till those flowers were mostly spent, shear them off, replace them. He's just like Edward Scissorhands out there. But obviously, those look good. The best looking Indigo spires I'd ever seen. That's a horrible picture, but they eventually bred a dwarf Indigo spires, and it's called Mystic spires. And so there's Mystic spires, which basically looks like what Bill did, except without the shearing all the time. So it's been named a Texas superstar, and you can buy Mystic spires, get the same look, but instead of being 7 feet tall, you're looking at 3 feet tall tops, but a really good plant. Mystic spires salvia. I saw Lowe's had a new shipment of these in the other day. So some of the things that used to be hard to find are the box store now. So Salvia granitica, the anise scented sage or royal blue sage is a good salvia to grow in almost all of Texas. Comes in a light blue called Argentine Skies. Comes in one that has black calyces on it called black and blue. All good. And I noticed on Facebook the other day, some lady was flipping out because my hummingbird feeders were blue, and we're all trained to think, it's got to be red. Well, hummingbirds are a lot smarter than that. So it's about nectar source, concentration of sugars. And the reason I've brought that up now is because I remember years ago when I worked in San Antonio, there was a group at Zilker Botanic Garden that did hummingbird counts. to see which plants attracted the most hummingbirds. And the number one plant in that garden was that plant right there, a blue flower. And I remember thinking, oh, well, that's unusual. And so it was my first lesson. It's not all about the red of the flower. It's about nectar and location and all that sort of thing. So good plant for bees and hummingbirds and butterflies. Of course, butterflies are showy and charismatic. So mostly people ignore the bees and, take a picture of the butterfly. But most salvias are more bee plants. Mexican bush sage or salvia leucantha is another example of a dry-loving plant from Mexico that actually does well in East Texas. I say does well. Any plant that has, first of all, if you see a plant that has gray leaves or white leaves or fuzzy leaves, that tells you it comes from a dry climate. And so white to reflect sunlight, hairs to insulate itself and prevent evapotranspiration. So that means don't overwater it, don't plant it in a wet spot, don't plant it in the soil that stays mucky. And so it's telling you where it came from and where to plant it. And so prime example, salvia leucantha does very well in just about all of Texas, but the part, if you're going to kill it, it's going to be from planting it in a place too wet, planting it where the downspout is, or when we get in a wet winter and you've got it in a spot that doesn't drain well. And so anything that's from a dry climate doesn't want to be dry during a hurricane, doesn't want to be wet during a 10-day tropical event, and also doesn't want to be 3 months wet during the wintertime. So if you see silver or gray, make sure good drainage. Because a lot of those silver gray plants, you think about lavender, is just waiting to die here because there's more moisture in the air here than it gets in its native habitat. So some of the plants just literally don't fit. And so when you say gray leaf, you make sure somebody proves it to you ahead of time that it's adaptive. A guy called me one year, I want to put in a lavender farm. I said, don't do it. He's like, no, it's going to work. My wife's always wanted one. And I said, they're going to die. Of course, my wife gets on to me for being negative. Like, I got to tell people the truth before they waste a bunch of money. And so he's arguing with me. And I gave him prime examples of lavender farms that had failed, including the ones out around Athens. And they had professional horticulturists plant them. They had gravel mulch. They had drip irrigation, raised beds, still were dying. So they bought $5,000 each fans to go around the lavender to blow across them. I love taking pictures of $5,000 fans blowing on dead lavender. And he's like, well, there's a place in Louisiana doing it. And I said, how long have they been doing it? Because that's even going to die even quicker. And so, yeah, you can pull it off as long as it still mimics, the Mediterranean. But at some point, we quit mimicking the Mediterranean and turn into a swamp. And so he said, 2 or 3 years. And I said, I'm just telling you, I wouldn't spend a lot of money. And like the questions we get as master gardeners in the horticulture office, he said, well, I already did it. Why have I gone? I said, I'll be the first one to come out there and take pictures and write you up in my column. And never heard from him again, which means they're all dead. And so anyway, that's just, so when it comes to questions, we have a help desk in our office. And so I wrote an article one year about the kind of questions we get. You either get the ones that argue every word out of your mouth like him. And you always want to say, if you knew the answer, why are you calling me? And then, actually, this is even more like him, the ones that ask the question over and over and over again. Do you say what they want to hear, which generally means they've already done it. Will you confirm what I did? And you can say, no. And he's like, will you say, yes, okay, that's what I need to hear, bye. So now, as with some age and experience, I'm like, tell me the answer you want to hear so I can just say this now and turn the 30-minute conversation into a 3-second conversation, because you're just going to... And then the tiny little percentage that you get, they ask the question, you tell them the right answer, they go home and do it. That's rare as chicken teeth. And so that's the 3 kind of questions you're gonna get. This comes in a purple with a white flower, a purple calyx with a purple flower, and a rare pink calyx with a white flower that's a little bit weaker, but a good plant. Fall bloomer though. Fall bloomers are extremely important in Texas because that's when the hummingbirds are migrating, that's when the monarchs are migrating. Unfortunately, coming from a rancher dad and driving the roadside every day, people mow their pastures, do the last cutting the hay, and mow the roadside all during and right before those migrations. And so hummingbirds and monarchs flying all the way that distance have very few flowers. And so as gardeners, we need to plant more fall blooming plants. Break time, or y'all need to like run and never come back. So
No.
that's okay. It's happened before. Seriously, it has. I don't mind it. You can't offend me.
He's worried that we're gonna run out of.
No, I'm not worried. I expect it.
He's gonna run out of space.
I'll turn that off before I say something.